So you see here, I'm building out an initial assessment for Module 4, the new module. And what we've done is pulled out all the human stuff. If it has to do with people, users, hackers, cyber professionals, working Janes and Joes, using technology, using data, using systems, anybody that touches bits and bytes, anybody that connects to a network, anybody that stores data, anybody that has personal devices, basically anybody that's a human being, right? That has to do with Module 4. So we've pulled all that out. And essentially what we've done is, if you have not completed yet, you should have a virtual machine that's running Kali at this point. Everybody can see the screen, yeah? And for the solution for Module 4, all you did was repeat what you did in Module 3 for incident handling, only this time you recorded your steps while you were on screen. Second assignment for Module 2 was to install Screencast-O-Matic so that you could do that, unless you were on a Mac, in which case you could use QuickTime or something else, iTunes. Might be QuickTime. Here's what we did for Module 5. We pulled out the tools part and the security controls and bound them together. Why did we do this conceptually? Both malicious actors and cyber professionals use hacker tools. They just use them for different purposes. Both hackers and cyber professionals use security controls just for different reasons. In fact, if a cyber professional or a technology professional fails to use some of the security controls correctly, one thing I want to emphasize is that hackers don't have to do anything to access the information. They just walk right in. And that's significant when you think about it. But they also use those security controls to cover their own tracks, to prevent viewing by others. So they yoke security controls just the same as cyber professionals do. And I make a big point of that at the beginning of the study guide. So I've basically refactored the study guide. We have a couple of quick learning objectives that we've added to the front of this. And I do want to share with you that most of what you need to know for this last module can be found in the study guide. There's about 15 pages of material, but it's a condensation of the stuff out of the textbook. And so what I'd love for you to do is to, after we hit the high points today, I would like very much for you to get on screen and try your hand at a first attempt of the Module 5 assessment, right? So Module 4 and Module 5 are like the last components of our material. And once again, we've sort of split it up into the human element and then the tools and controls side of the house, right? What we want you to do is to think about the users and the folks who wield the tools and controls while you're working through those tools and controls. So I know this was a little short fuse in terms of the material reorganization. However, when you go inside Module 5, one thing you'll find is that you have two very short assignments. Now, the second one, you're going to start throwing stuff at me after Thanksgiving if you do want to plan a little bit of time. And I want you to notice the due dates, right? So it's Monday before Thanksgiving. You don't have to do it before Thanksgiving. It would probably be best if you did it before Thanksgiving. What you'll find is that some people have no problem whatsoever, and they sail right through this in 45 minutes. If your system is in good shape, if you don't use it for gaming or other naughty personal things, you won't have a problem working with the security controls on your system. But if you have a compromised and corrupted system, there might be a few hiccups along the way. You might run into some issues if you're multitasking like a wild man and you have 57 tabs open on your browser. I'm just saying, if you do some things that are bad habits on your personal technology, it might take a little longer, but I have known students to rip through this in 45 minutes flat. If they just watch the video first and then they review the assignment document, right? Now this one, can everybody see this word here? What does option mean? Is it required? Does the word option, is the word option associated with required? It means it's up to you. And I would urge you to do this, right? I would urge you to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and record a separate session. I'm going to demo the use of a live USB, because essentially, if you get a hold of a 700 meg install media, 700 megs, which is nothing. That's much smaller than your average bootleg movie. Or I'm just saying, 700 megs, it's less than a gig of download, right? That's the entire install footprint for a Linux operating system known as Debian. And it's Debian that is the foundation upon which Ubuntu is built, Kali is built, Mint is built. There's all sorts of flavors of Linux that are built on top of Debian. That said, if you create the most basic, smallest, cheapest, bootable USB drive with a utility known as Etcher or something known as PenDrive Ultimate, right? And if you decide you want to use something different, if you want to use a tool called Rufus, if some of you are more familiar with building bootable USBs with other tools, I'm not going to restrict you in terms of how you build the USB, but I do want to ferret out a YouTube, and there's so many of them about Etcher, and I have one that's very short, it's 4 minutes or less, and I want to watch it and then follow the steps and make sure that the latest version works like the YouTube does. Oftentimes there are little glitches when a new version of a thing comes out. The menus are a little different, the features are a little different. You just have to kind of fish around with it. The important point is that you build this thing. One point is logged for a view of the USB after it's prepared. And if you're working on a system that doesn't show anything because of your choice of bootable operating system, it's like it can't be read by NTFS, that's okay. Just show me that when you plug this thing in, it's barking at you to format the thing. What am I saying? Sometimes when you create a bootable USB, other file systems cannot view it. And when you plug it into another system, it'll bark and say it needs to be formatted. That doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means you haven't restarted your system, selected USB to boot, and then booted from there. The other point is awarded when I see a view of your system running in the USB. Now, why is this such a slick tool? Well, this is good for both hackers and cyber professionals, both, because you can basically get into a machine with a completely different operating system. So there are no log entries that you were on there. Now that's good and that's bad, okay? It also means that if ultimately a hacker has physical access to your system, forget it. All they have to do is go out to YouTube, build a bootable USB, get an extra hard drive, get in there when you're not around, and they can capture everything, all your Kool-Aid, right? But it's also ideal if your laptop crashes. It won't boot. It's got a corrupt boot sector. Something's wrong. You still have data on there. You still have photos. You still have movies, class projects. You have important stuff you've done, papers you've written, right? You want to get that information off of your drive. So once again, the reality here is that hacker tools and security controls are both wielded by both sides of the arena, okay? And what I want you to do is I want you to experience for yourself what it's like to boot into a live USB. Now, I will have a short video to accompany this, in addition to the YouTube that shows you how to build the USB. Any questions before we go? Now, you have PowerPoint slides from Module 8 or Chapter 8 about security technology, the access controls, firewalls, and VPNs, okay? It's a large chapter. There's 88 slides. I do not want anyone to freak out and think, OMG, it's the last day of class. Here comes Ken Top. You hear this little beep, 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 like the dump truck is backing up, you know, and it's going to tilt the bed of the dump truck up. And then here comes 100 tons of stuff on you 2 days before Thanksgiving. That's not the case. The most important things you should do with these slides is check them for similar terms and concepts you discover as you're reading the study guide. What am I saying? Don't spend your time scouring every slide in here, because the authors want to basically frame every concept in a very general manner. What I want to do is give you specific examples of what matters most, right? And what I want you to do is to take certain terms and ideas from the study guide and the addendum. And then if you want, if you want additional information, because you got extra time on your hands, go looking for additional information in the slides, okay? I'm just trying to help everybody keep their perspective. So, hacker tools and cyber controls. Describe and use some basic hacker tools to identify and remedy system exposures. Now, here's the thing that we were just talking about the USB. And what I've done in the first section is taken each of these and broken them down into 7 quick summaries. Let's talk about that live USB. Let's pretend that everybody is vulnerable and exposed to a live USB attack, because we are. Is anyone aware of what you can do on any system to prevent the use of a live USB on that system? Oh, and by the way, if you don't have a physical USB to use for the optional assignment, there's an alternative setup where you can actually do the assignment and you use a 2 GB virtual hard disk and you format it so it behaves like a USB, and then you attach it to a virtual. It's really cool. So if you run into that problem and you don't have a spare thumb drive to use, you need an 8 gig or a 16 gig thumb drive. It doesn't have to be new. It doesn't have to be fast. It just has to be a spare. And if you don't have that, we can still work with it. We can create a 4 gig virtual hard disk, name it USB, attach it to your system so your system thinks you've just plugged in a USB. And then you can load the stuff and boot from it in a virtual machine. So that's a workaround. I'll mention more of this in the video. So if somebody physically has access, after they plug in that USB, what do they have to do in order to be able to get on the screen with it? What's the first physical activity any hacker or cyber professional needs to perform while you're plugging in that USB? If you put another way, if you plug in the live bootable USB on an active system, is it going to like reboot spontaneously? Go ahead. Well, so there might be a pop-up, and there might be a pop-up about whether or not it's formatted. In all likelihood, nothing will happen. What do you have to physically do to the system in order for the USB to engage a live operating system off that thumb drive? Yes. Suleiman said you have to go into the BIOS after you reboot the system. So you get ready to plug it in, you reboot or restart the system, and oftentimes you can't even get to that prompt if you're just restarting. It's a common thing for people to have to power off the system fully and then power it on before the boot options come up. You use the boot options to get into the BIOS, and you change the boot order temporarily. In fact, sometimes there are boot order options that present even without getting into the BIOS. There'll be a little prompt that says press F12. On Dell computers, you can walk into the computer lab, reboot the system, watch. Half the time there'll be a little, hey, F12 for boot options, which means you can boot from a network card, you can boot from a USB, you can boot from the local hard drive, that kind of thing. The point is that if you want to remediate this exposure, you can go into the BIOS and disable access to the boot order and then password protect the BIOS. Because a physical hacker is not going to be able to get into the BIOS. They're not going to be able to select the boot order. Few people ever think of protecting their BIOS with a password. Few people ever think of restricting access on reboot to the boot order. It's usually active in most cases, and that's where people get into big trouble. It's a very simple remedy. But I want you to know that as we start here, there are very simple tools you can use. You can watch 15 minutes of video and you can get into somebody's Kool-Aid, and then you can be wearing prison orange if it goes sideways. Because under the right circumstances, it's a bad thing to get into people's Kool-Aid unless you are in there for the right reason. That's what I'm saying. Okay. Any questions about the first piece here? So each one of these sections, you notice how they're all in bold, number 1, number 2, number 3. Down below, each one of them is addressed separately. Now this one, I get into before we ever get into the live USB, right? Oh, yeah. Oh, I think this is the one with, yeah, this is the one. I actually got it in here. This is the one that shows you how to use the etcher.
Hi, this is Ian Buckley with MakeUseOf.com, and today we're going to make live installs of Linux onto USB sticks. Now, I'm just going to...
Again, you're going to use the fastest, smallest footprint for Linux, and what you'll find is that if you boot in with a USB, it takes a single command, 2 letters, DD, dumb and dumber, just DD, and then an external hard drive with a few extra options, copy the entire hard drive off of a thing into an external hard drive. Incredibly devastating, right? In any case, in your study guide, before that point, I talk about something we mentioned at the very beginning of class. Does everybody know what I mean by first account exposure?
Yes, the very first account that you get with computers and apps.
Correct. When you're first configuring a brand new system, it asks you, who's going to use this computer? And it doesn't matter if it's a Mac, if it's Linux, if it's Windows. And when you set up that first account, what kind of privileges does it have? Root, admin, godlike privileges. So as soon as you get online and you're like, woohoo, I got a new system. Anything you click, anything you touch online also executes with that same level of privilege. We're coming full circle here. We mentioned this at the beginning of the class, here and there. What are some things you need to know about to keep yourself safe? What are some basic security controls? And what's the biggest, fattest one they never do? This one right here. What's the other one they don't do? They don't restrict access to the BIOS with a password. They don't exclude the use of a boot menu, right? I could, and I'm not bragging here, but I could walk into a computer lab in most universities. I could plug in, change a few wires, or do a few things like that, open up a screen, reboot each of the systems, and then bring the entire campus down with just the computers that are running in that computer lab. That's because most computer labs don't restrict that kind of stuff. If it's not password protected, it should be. All right. Any questions about the first 2 things we talked about? And that first one, I'm pulling all the way back from the beginning of time at the very beginning of this course. First account exposure. That should technically be listed number 2. Maybe I should I go back and add first account exposure back in there? Should I? Just so you don't forget it. Because there it is at the top. I might do that yet. I might tweak it. In any case, all right, we've talked about the first 2. Let's talk about Nmap. There are some really cool videos, and there's one that I like. He's really obnoxious. He's very fast. He drinks lots of coffee, and he covers really cool stuff. It's called Network Chuck, right? Network Chuck. And Network Chuck is very good at explaining a lot of complex things very quickly. And I like that. I kind of admire that. to me, people who do that, that's a pretty cool skill. The one thing that Network Chuck doesn't do is he doesn't tell you that you shouldn't do most of the stuff that he's about to show you. Or he kind of mentions it, but he does it really fast while he's hyped up on, like, I don't know, 6 espressos. And it's like going over a speed bump in a parking lot. And then he shows you so many cool things. You're like, oh my gosh, I got to try this. Because what you're doing is responding to Chuck's cool stuff. He gets more views. He gets more followers. That's how he gets, well, he's wealthy. He has a lot of followers, okay? He's very popular on YouTube. He's very popular for a reason. When you click this, he's going to show you all kinds of cool stuff. You're only going to use this command. Why are you only going to use this command? It's the one command you're going to use just to see what's connected in your home network. That's a safe command. It's a docile command. You won't go to jail using this command. If you do half the stuff that Chuck shows you, you'll be wearing prison orange in no time, right? Let me get back to that. In any case, I wanted to share with you, you're going to use that Kali virtual machine. You're going to turn up the Kali virtual machine. Then you're going to run Nmap with this command. You already have the Kali virtual machine running, or it's available because you completed it in a previous assignment. Yes? Okay, all right, we're good. Wireshark. There are some things about Wireshark that kill people all the time. I just thought I would talk about this because Wireshark is a very popular tool, kind of like Nmap. Wireshark has been around a long time, and Wireshark is actually owned by a commercial company now, and they give away Wireshark free. Commercial product is really serious stuff, but you can get into all sorts of serious trouble with the open source product as well. The thing that I want you to understand is how and what a sniffer does. A sniffer takes the traffic on a network, and it takes all that traffic on the network, and it puts it under a microscope. Any network sniffer has that capability. Wireshark is among the most popular and well-known. The thing that I want you to understand is that there's a couple of things that often stymie Wireshark users. And I would also tell you that when you use Wireshark, you got to be sure that you have approval first before working trials with this amazing tool. Now, did I say that you have to have approval first before you actually use it in production, or for trials? Trials. You know what trials are? I'm going to try this for 3 seconds and see if it brings down the whole network. Because I've watched that happen, where somebody turns on a switch with Wireshark and they don't have the right stuff in place on the backbone of the network, and bad things happen. And just to make a long story short, you want to try some things before you turn them all the way up, especially with Wireshark. Now, the other thing that I want you to understand is that a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Wireshark and its cousins were making too much progress getting into everyone's Kool-Aid. So the entire computer industry got together and came up with an innovation to nullify the capability of wire sniffers. It's called a switch. Now that doesn't sound like much, but the difference between a network hub and a switch is that a switch isolates the traffic to just one port, a single port. So most people connect to a wired environment and they're ready to see all sorts of stuff on their screen if they're using Wireshark, and then they can't. And that's because on the back end, it's a switch. And what they have to do is change a setting to create what's referred to as a mirror or span port. What you're doing is taking a switch and you're taking one port and you're telling that one port to copy and carry all other traffic from all other ports. If you don't do that and then connect that to Wireshark, you won't get what you're supposed to see on the entire network. The other thing you have to do is you have to change the port that Wireshark uses into promiscuous mode. What am I saying about promiscuous mode? Very quickly. It's kind of like the reverse of incognito mode. So instead of being really surreptitious and clandestine, which is what incognito mode is all about. And by the way, incognito mode doesn't protect any of the packets that, when you're in incognito mode and you're on the network and somebody's running Wireshark, they still see what you're doing. The only thing incognito does is prevent Google from logging what you're searching. That's it. So Google doesn't, well, they claim they don't. They don't. They claim they don't. There's a lot of privacy concerns about Google. All right.
We're still seeing from the website.
Yeah, they're still seeing stuff, but they're not tracking that for your behavior so that they can feed up ads. That's all they're doing. Doesn't mean they don't log it. So if I go to my settings here and my network card, you'll notice that I can change it to bridged mode, and then in advanced, I can change it so that I allow all VMs to use promiscuous mode. What I'm doing is telling that NIC, okay, I'm setting up a span or a mirror port. I want you to have all of it. I want you to accept all of it. Because most network interface cards are used to working with switches, and they're used to only receiving what is destined for that specific MAC address. When you open up your network card into promiscuous mode, you change its behavior. And that's profound, because what can happen next is that the security appliances on the network, Eric Pattison at UVI will be the one calling you and saying, why are you operating in promiscuous mode on our network? You want to explain that to me? It means that your system is intending to do a Wireshark data sniffing activity, and most security appliances on a network can pick up that difference. If there's a NIC that's running in promiscuous mode, a lot of network analyzers can find cards that are operating in promiscuous mode, which is another reason why you want approval first. Okay, those are common Wireshark pitfalls. Now, are you going to actually practice that no, you're not. Okay. Two-factor authentication. Here's another big one. Here's a control that sadly, too many people do not use. Everybody needs to set up a simple second identity option to enhance login security for the device itself or for an important resource on the device. So in other words, when you're performing your solution and you're setting up two-factor authentication, you don't have to set up two-factor authentication for your entire Windows login if you don't want your laptop to use two-factor, but you can use two-factor for Gmail or for other resources online. You can set up two-factor authentication for a bank account. There's all sorts of options to set up two-factor. I just want you to do it and practice it. Everywhere that two-factor is an option, you should be using it. Now, one thing that most people are confused about is how two-factor works. Sometimes they just set up two-factor authentication and enter a second password. That is not two-factor authentication by definition. What it means is that you're doing the same kind of thing to prove who you are, and that's only one type of authentication factor. You have to do something different, perform a different type of task. That means you're entering with biometrics. If you're scanning a fingerprint, it's something that you have, your fingerprint, as opposed to something you know, a password. Those are different methods of authentication. Does that make sense? That's a common fallacy with two-factor authentication. Moving right along. Inheritance. This one is a killer. This one is a killer. Did I mention this one is a killer? Okay, so by default, when you have I'm going to create a new drive directory called secrets. Okay, is everybody with me? Secrets. And here's the fun part. When I go into secrets, let's make the view a little bigger here. So here I am in secrets, right? And let's pretend that I want to use what? Access controls. Another word for access controls is permissions. I can set permissions to keep everybody out. I can deny read privileges and so on. So usually what I do is I right-click there and go into properties. And here's the thing, if I go into security, it already has brand new. I mean, I just made this, right? I just created it. You watched me create this, yeah? Secrets. So I want to keep stuff in there and I want to keep it secret. But if there are authenticated users on my system, they can modify, read, execute, list, read, write. How about the system itself? Well, the system itself and root accounts can do all that. Well, what about users? Users are anybody who can access your system, whether they are authenticated or not. Do you notice the distinction here? There are two listed groups. One called authenticated users, meaning, oh, I had an account and a login for this person to use my machine. And look at what they can do. Darn near everything, right? Authenticated users can modify, read and execute, list folder contents, read and write, all that good stuff, right? So as long as you have an account, for those of you that say, oh, I'm going to add a second account for my younger sister to keep them safe, just remember that the default permissions, they're inheriting from the C drive, and this is the part I want you to understand. The way that Windows and most operating systems work, when you create a new file system object, it inherits the permissions from the parent above. You have to understand this is how it works. Look at users. Why does Microsoft do this? Oh, by the way, Apple does this too. Oh, by the way, Linux kind of does this, but not as much. Everybody says Linux is that much safer. They just want everybody to be able to see and view things. Because if you are trying to share things and you create a folder and you want other people to have that, then basically you can do this. Everybody see this padlock right here, company finances? Yes. So there's a second option called encryption. We're going to talk about that. Encryption is not access control. At a bare minimum, what you should do is configure access control or permissions. Now, when I go to get rid of this, because I don't want just any user, I mean just any user, never mind the authenticated ones, just any user that connects, that gets on my system. If I try to remove that and I do this, and I want to take that out, it says you can't remove users because the object is inheriting permissions from its parent. Now this confuses and bumfuzzles the average person who's using a computer. They don't understand what parent. We don't have parent controls set up on this machine. It starts to get goofy. It's the choice of description here. What they're referring to is that you have to turn off the option for inheriting permissions and then try to remove them. What they're saying is you have to go in here and you have to disable inheritance from the advanced option. Once you disable inheritance, see it says inherited from the root of the C drive. Everybody see that right here? If I disable inheritance, it's going to say, okay, do you want to remove everything or just copy them? I'm going to convert the inherited permissions, meaning I'm going to copy them. I want to keep most of them because I'd still be able to use them. So I'm going to hit convert. And now, where is it inherited from? None. So now I can take users and what can I do? Remove users. But here's the fun part. If I check this other box down here, replace all child object permission entries with inheritable permissions from this object, what I'm doing is saying, okay, going forward, oh, I want to modify this thing. If somebody is actually not administrators, whoop, that would be bad. Authenticated users, see how it says modify? Let's pretend that you only want authentic users to be able to read stuff. I'm going to modify this and edit it, and I'm going to take off modify and write. So that basically authenticated users can read, write, and execute, but they can't change things. I'm going to say, okay. Now, if I don't check this box turns inheritance back on at that directory level. In other words, inside secrets, when I add data files, when I add subdirectories, when I do anything inside there, they will automatically inherit these new permissions. So I can use inheritance to my advantage instead of my disadvantage. I want to do that. I want to say apply, and then yes, and then okay, and okay. So if I go into secrets and I have a quick file that says, I'm going to create a folder here that says really secret stuff. And I go inside there and I have folders. Well, all right, so there are restrictions inside here. I should be able to, the point is that you can see that there are limitations to my options inside the secrets folder, that what I set up I did in a hurry. So now I have a little wrinkle here. Basically, it doesn't matter how many nested folders or directories I do. Now, I could try to drag something in here and see if I can drag a separate file inside to see if it would let me do that. But my login is an authenticated login. So it could be that when I try to go into secrets, let's see if I can drag Punch Buggy into secrets, or really secrets. It says I need to provide administrator permission. So I can click continue, and then I can put in my password. You get the point, is that even if I try to create other file system objects inside a directory that's protected, where the restrictions or the permissions and access controls are changed, when I check that other box down below, that enforces it inside that directory so that people can't change up Charlie once they get inside. That's huge. And most people don't learn how to do this effectively so that it works to their advantage and not to the advantage of the bad guy, okay?
You created it, you did not check the right option, so you can't.
That's what it was. That's what it was. So I didn't check the box that said right. So if I'm an authenticated user that I want to have permission, I can set up group permissions or individual account permissions. So that's what this one is about. Disable inheritance to enforce explicit permissions. Just remember that you turn off inheritance to block the settings for access control. You make your changes and then you check the other box, okay? And it shows, here's a screenshot of what we're talking about. So when you download this study guide, you'll have this information. Now, in Linux, you would use the change mode command, or chmod, as some people call it, and you'd use something called a -R to turn the inheritance back on again, or +R. So what you'd end up doing is you'd turn off inheritance. That's called recursion. So if you're not careful with recursion in Linux, you can really, well, you can basically lock yourself out of every directory. If you're in root and you don't know you're in root, you should always use great care whenever you use recursion in Linux. But the idea of inheritance and enforcing permissions into subdirectories, that still works in Linux. You just have to work it a different way. Any questions about inheritance before we move on? Okay. Now, why am I spending all the time for our last class on stuff like this? Well, it's not the kind of thing you'd read in most books. However, when you get to the other student learning objectives further down, we go into things like firewalls, intrusion protection systems, routers, all that good stuff. It's just summary information about those tools and what they do. Any questions so far? Yeah. The addendum basically has a quick breakout of definitions, okay? So you're going to want to review those definitions and understand that. This is really cool, though. I want to call this out before we talk about encryption. There are two kinds of encryption available to Windows users. One that's whole disk encryption called BitLocker, and it often employs the use of a hardware chip that speeds up the encryption access process called TPM, Trusted Platform Module. If you want to run Windows 11, you have to have a TPM module, version 2.0 or higher, in order to run Windows 11, because Windows 11 makes use of BitLocker, and it wants to use the latest version of TPM or a more current version of TPM, because the first version of TPM has already been what? Hacked. And that's just a quick point of saying that we're always working on a new moving target. In any case, the thing I want you to understand is that If you want to lock an entire hard disk, you use BitLocker. But what about if you just want to do some other stuff, where you just want to encrypt regular files on a system? If you have a version of Windows Professional or higher, encryption file system is built in. It's really cool. All you have to do is look at the properties and then click the advanced button. So what am I talking about? I want to call your attention to some things that often stymie people. Where's my secrets folder? Everybody see my secrets folder? I went into properties and then I went into the security tab first, and then I went into advanced. I went into the advanced options button on the security tab. Everybody got me? If I go a different route and I just go to the properties and I click advanced right here, I can check this one little box that says encrypt the contents to secure data. And if I do that, what will happen is that it gives me a choice. Do I want to encrypt just the directory, or do I want to encrypt the directory and all of its contents? But something else magical happens when you do this for the very first time. It's going to ask you, okay, yeah, apply changes to this folder, subfolders, and files. I'm going to accept that and say, okay. And then it says, you'll need to provide administrator permissions to change this attribute. Well, that's because I changed the permissions there. All right, now notice the padlock. The padlock means it's encrypted. Where is the encryption key? The first time you do this on a Windows system, it's going to ask you, would you like to keep a backup copy of your encryption key? This is always a good idea. But what's not a good idea is to take the encryption key and then store it on a thumb drive along with the encrypted files. Now, I'm just saying, that'd be like handing the keys to a burglar. And I'm just saying that people do that. They're like, oh, I got to keep a backup copy of my key so I can decrypt it. If you're on another system, now, what am I saying? The key for this decryption process, so you can use it and view it, is tied to the owner. It's tied to the account you're logged into. The encryption key is joined at the hip to the user account that did the encryption. So if you're on a different system and you don't have that same owner account there, you can't use it. Now, if you're in an Active Directory domain, that's where the real magic happens. If you're in an Active Directory domain and you have that user login, anywhere you log in, that encryption key is going to be active, and you'll be able to decrypt no matter where you are if you're using a computer that's joined to the domain and you're using your user account that's also on the domain. That's really cool. The point is that you should answer yes, get a backup copy, but please don't put it on the same thumb drive where you keep the encrypted data, because that's just wrong. And then, yes, hackers will find your USB thumb drive and they will do very, very bad things with it. Now, I know I'm stating the obvious, but you'd be shocked at how often we have to state the obvious. All right. Any questions about encryption? Oh, that's too much.
No question.
Okay. The encryption file system works really well on a USB. So if you have files and directories that are on a USB and then somebody else sticks it into their laptop, they won't be able to view it. Even if they change the permissions, even if they commandeer the permissions and privileges and assign full rights to view it, they will not be able to view that file. I want to tell you this right now. Encryption is the only tool that can protect data and systems when other security controls fail. But encryption itself is also vulnerable. There are some Achilles heels. If I ask you which tool is the only fail-safe way to keep somebody from getting into your Kool-Aid if they lay hold of your computer. Now, we said if a hacker gets a hold of your computer physically, they can use a USB thumb drive to get in there. So let's say that happens. They still can't read your stuff if it's encrypted. So think about the USB thing and then think about encryption and why that's a big deal. Now, Pi-hole. Oh, by the way, we said BitLocker was the whole disk encryption that's used in Windows. Does anybody know what it's called on a Mac? On a Mac system?
I'm not sure what it is on a Mac.
It's called FireVault. If you turn on FireVault on Macs, or you turn on BitLocker, you'll notice that your system is a good bit slower. And that's because of the overhead associated with encryption and decryption. Put another way, every single bit and byte on that disk is encrypted, and it has to be decrypted in order to be displayed. Okay. Notice, I'm going to say it one more time. Yes, get a backup copy of the encryption key. No, do not put the copy of the encryption key with the data you're trying to protect. Happens all the time. Or people put it on a separate USB, and what happens to the USB? What do you think happens to the USB? It gets stolen or lost, and then they don't have the backup key, and then the system crashes, and they don't have the user account anymore, and they still can't get into it. That's really bad, okay? Check this out. Has anyone ever heard of a Raspberry Pi? One of the things that happens all the time for common security problems, so if we're looking back at our list now, explain how, we're on the last item, how Pi-hole enhances residential and business network security. The Raspberry Pi is a simple device that it's actually Cambridge and Broadcom teamed together to provide, this is the size of a credit card here. Have we talked about this in class? $35. This $35 credit card sized computer has the same horsepower as a laptop from 5 years ago. Let me say that again. This $35 computer has as much muscle, hardware-wise, as laptops purchased just 5 years ago. I mean, just commodity laptops, right? Black Friday laptops, $300 cheap as dirt laptops, right? I'm not talking about fire-breathing gaming laptops, obviously, okay? But if you got a laptop on special 5 years ago and it's running slow, you could do better with a Raspberry Pi that's brand new right now. The important thing to understand is the rest of it. You can use that $35 computer and install something called Pi-hole. Pi-hole takes that Raspberry Pi and it turns it into a DNS server that you can connect in your home network environment. Once you do that, you tell your wireless router to use Pi-hole for DNS. Now, why would you care? Usually when people are responding to web pages or email, 90% of exploits occur through those two means. We've already established that, yes? That's because of the links. The links online and the links in email are the biggest problem. And if you have a Pi-hole in your network and somebody clicks on a link, oftentimes hackers will do something called redirection. You've seen this all the time. You go to watch YouTube because there's cool YouTubes. And then before long, here's an ad. And when you're trying to get rid of the ad, what happens half the time? Do you actually get rid of the ad or do you end up clicking it accidentally and now you're on another screen?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what happens all the time. Well, would it hurt your feelings if I told you that this is by design? It's intended to do that. I'm not going to tell you there is no Santa Claus next because, you know, I want you to do well on your finals. And if you still believe in Santa Claus, that's great. And I still believe in Santa Claus. Serious as a heart attack. I believe in Santa Claus. But I will tell you, if you don't believe that most people who work online resources are out to get something out of you and it's not whatever's free isn't free, that's the truth that will set you free. And so if you believe that there are people in this world that are trying to get you to take a look at something while they're while you're doing something else. That's the whole nature of advertising online now. The problem is that hackers understand this, and they'll hijack a redirection. Half the time when we're redirected to bad sites. The thing about Pi-hole is that it eats those bad sites. And more importantly, it kills half of the links and half of the ads that spontaneously load. So your web browsing, your YouTube, a lot of things are very much faster, twice as fast. When you're using your home network and you have Raspberry Pi running with a Pi-hole, it's like click, boom, it's right there, because half the time the links for the ads don't have to load. And you'd be shocked at how much embedded content there is. Now, we go through the Kali tool summary here just by clicking in the upper left corner of the Kali machine that you installed. It basically has categories in the upper left corner, and all I've done is listed them here. I want you to be familiar with each of those, right? I want you to know each of the tool categories. That's all. But I want you to understand that some of them, like Wireshark, there's one called Metasploit. There's another called Angry IP Scanner. If your instincts tell you not to use a tool called Angry IP Scanner because, I don't know, it might just do angry things on your network, listen to your instincts. Okay. Now, there's also other vulnerability scanning tools that are not a part of Kali you can get online. One popular one is called Acunetics, and another one we've mentioned already called Nessus. Hey, they'll let you use them, but the default settings are way too aggressive. So you got to be very, very careful with those things. If you're using Metasploit in Kali, if you're using Wireshark in Kali, if you're using Angry IP Scanner, if you're using some of the wireless hacking tools, you got to be very careful that you don't start a 5-alarm fire with your security appliances. But in particular, whenever you run vulnerability scanners like Acunetics and Nessus, they try to find every little hole on every little system and device, and they slow everything down. So there are other popular hacking tool suites like Blackbox, Slingshot, Kane, and the Fedora Security Spin. The thing I want you to understand about some of these is that they're not always up to date and they're no longer supported. Kane is designed for law enforcement officers, and the Italian gentleman who created this awesome tool set for law enforcement officers quit doing it. And I don't know if, like, some family men, like the mafia, got a hold of him because, you know, it was hurting that organized crime. I'm just saying, you know, could have been something like that. But the Italians just quit. They just stopped one day. I think they were more interested in driving Ferraris and drinking espresso. Something like that. But for some reason, Kane is no longer supported, right? So you can still get Kane, but the problem is that the tools are not up to date. So you might be able to update some of the tools manually, other cases you won't. I would not trust anything. There was a question or a comment. Yes?
I'll say it all. You have to pay for these hacking tools, or
The question was, do we have to pay for the hacking tools? Most of these are free, or they have free trials. And then after you use the free trials, you got to read the fine print. Sometimes they get you into big problems. All right, so the rest of this you can read, yeah? Because the rest of this, identity account management, I do want to share this one screen with you real quick. You're going to see this huge thing called identity account management. And in that description are two words, one that has to do with identity and the other one has to do with accounts. Identity has to do with authentication. Accounts has to do with permissions, okay? The two work hand in hand. Identity account management is a huge landscape, but basically whenever you hear about security factors, when you hear the word factor, you're talking about authentication. When you hear principles, you're talking about accounts. Security principles are accounts or groups. Those are definitions that throw a lot of people and they get really confused. The field is changing very quickly. This is the latest snapshot of where we are. Half the world of securing technology has to do with authentication. The other half has to do with, okay, now that they're properly authenticated, what exactly are they authorized to do when they get in there? The world is split up for security controls, and this is an oversimplification, but for the first part of all this, into two broad categories. The authentication piece, proving you are who you are, and the other side, okay, now that you're on the system or device, what are you authorized? What access controls, what permissions do you have? And that's it in a nutshell. So I am basically summarizing and condensing down about, I don't know, 10 years worth of material. Take some time to check out this diagram in particular for those of you that work in the IT department at the University of the Virgin Islands, because we mentioned something called single sign-on, which is what we do at UVI when you use the My Campus portal. It is a single sign-on mechanism that authenticates your access back to 16 other backend systems. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. Any questions before we clear and we stop? So everybody sees this, right? Identity means authentication. Account management means, right? Are you a user? Are you an administrator? What are your privileges and permissions? That kind of stuff. All right. I wish everyone a great Thanksgiving. Good luck on your first attempt of the module 4 and 5 assessment. And if you run into any snags doing the last assignment, there are videos, and basically what you should do is close all the other running screens, make sure your system's up to date, reboot. Half the time it works when you do that. Thank you for your patience this semester, and we'll be in touch before Thanksgiving and after Thanksgiving, and certainly through the finals week. All right. Bye-bye for now.
Goodbye.